Thanks for joining us for another episode of A Case of the Mondays. I'm your podcast host, Rameez, founder and CEO of 3R Strategy. I'm joined today by Rebecca Chilcott, who is Head of Reward at Arriva's UK Bus Division. With extensive experience in reward strategy across various sectors, Rebecca is currently leading a fascinating transformation journey at Arriva. In today's episode, we'll explore how organizations can create fair and effective pay strategies when operating under collective agreements and discover the practical solutions Rebecca has implemented to bring greater consistency and equity across diverse populations. Welcome to the podcast, Rebecca.
Thank you very much. Thank you for having me.
This is a topic that is, I think, of interest to a lot of reward professionals, particularly those that are operating within collective agreements or have unions that they regularly interact with. And so I'm interested in understanding the two different populations that you have, those that are collectively bargained and those that are not. Could you explain why these populations are so different and how this impacts potential pay negotiations that you might have?
Absolutely. So our collective bargain population essentially means that our paying conditions are negotiated between the company and union representatives. Whereas our non-collectively bargained population, paying conditions are determined by the company itself, according to certain pay structures and certain market insights. So the main difference is that relationship with the union. The union have a really valuable role to play, but the difficulty comes in the complexity. So within our organisation, we have 47 different collective bargaining units. We have approximately 13,000 employees, and only about 600 of those are non-collectively bargained. So the vast majority are collectively bargained. And with so many different bargaining units, it really does drive a very kind of difficult landscape to work across.
Okay, so I guess the immediate question a lot of people might have is, why do you have 47 different collectively bargained units, and why wouldn't a lot of these be agreed in like one or two different units, for example? Why do you feel the need to have, or why does there need to be so many different units?
It's a really good question. And when I first joined the bus division, I myself had that kind of very same question. So the reason we have so many different collective bargaining units is the nature of how we have grown as a business. So as we've grown through acquisition, we have had different terms and conditions in place and different collective bargaining units as a result. Now, we have considered and debated, is it, the pros and cons of maintaining very different collective bargaining structures or moving to a more national structure. The risk of a national approach is in the strike action. So if you consider the nature of our business, running and operating buses, if we were to negotiate nationally, the risk of strike would be across a national footprint. And so, yes, it does drive a lot of complexity to have so many different bargaining units, but it's a balance of that kind of risk or threat of strike.
Okay, I mean that does sound like it probably creates a lot of challenges for you, because if we think about this from a reward perspective, you have so many different collectively bargained units, but if you were looking at equal pay, for example, from an organizational perspective, it's there's not a lot that you can do, for example. And is that something that is obviously the threat of a strike is quite a big challenge, but at the same time, I know that unions also have quite a big focus on equal pay and people being treated in the same way. Is this something that has ever come up from their side, for example, to say, actually, we would like you to have more common terms among the different units, or is there a resistance from them to say, actually, we want to stick with what we have?
There is certainly an undercurrent of maintaining the way that we've always worked, certainly, and that presents its own challenges. I suppose what we, seek to do is just acknowledge what those complexities are, and try and work and kind of operate and navigate around those. So our strategy has been to start with the foundations, start with a set of kind of principles and pay philosophy that we can, upskill and engender across the individuals that hold those negotiations with the union representatives, to equip them in the best way possible to have those meaningful conversations, to have that meaningful dialogue, and to have those meaningful conversations around pay. So that's the approach that we've taken. We've sort of stood up a national working party of individuals that are responsible for those pay negotiations in their business units, and we do things like share approach, share data, share analysis, and really share our pay ethos, which is to drive a fair, equitable and transparent approach to pay. And it is a journey for us. Absolutely would describe that as a maturity journey. So not something that we have, completely cracked the nut yet, but we're laying the foundations in place to be able to, progress that conversation, progress the dialogue in that way.
I mean, it's great to hear what you just said: fair, equitable, and transparent approach to pay, which, we always love hearing that, because that's essentially our organizational mission here at 3R Strategy. But I'm wondering whether when you look at the 47 different units, are there any other challenges that, because obviously you talked about your pay philosophy and applying that philosophy across all of your business units, but do you face any other challenges in ensuring consistency across those units?
Yeah, one fact again that I didn't anticipate coming into the role and coming into the business about 3 years ago was actually how much of a dynamic our market context would play. So depending on our footprint and our presence in the market drives what kind of market payer we are. So if we have a big footprint, we're one of the majority operators in a particular market, we are are able to have a more competitive rate of pay. When we are a smaller operator with much less market footprint, then that is where we tend to find that we have to pitch our market rates at that lower end. So that was an interesting dynamic that I hadn't appreciated, and because of the nature of our business, we do look so different across our different regions in terms of our footprint and our markets.
Okay, yeah, I mean, that's because I guess that's also that fits in with the pay philosophy that you talked about. And again, I think it's great that you have that sort of understanding and transparency to say, if there are differences, these are the reasons why those differences exist.
Yeah.
You also talked about transparency. How do you have any challenges around transparency, given the fact that you have so many different collectively bargained units, but also the population that is not collectively bargained?
Yeah, our challenges are very different. So I'll take it each in turn. I'll start with
Okay.
collectively bargained, and then I'll move on to our non-collectively bargained population. Within our collectively bargained population, there is transparency in as much as our weights and wages are public. When we advertise on the basis of our rates. The complexity in our collectively bargained population, as I described, is the multiple nature of the kind of different pay and different terms and conditions. So transparency is there because those things are made public, but it's more complex because of the variety and the differences that we have. And then in our non-collectively bargained population, that's really where we're in our infancy of our transparency journey. And that is something that we absolutely are inspirational about. But has meant that we've really had to focus on getting the foundations right and building those foundations so that we can have kind of open and clear conversations around pay. So really we've invested quite heavily in ensuring that we've got the right job architecture. We had quite a robust architecture for our management population, but below the management tiers was one group we didn't differentiate. So what we've done recently is introduce that structure and better understand ourselves, the internal peer relativities, how that might play against the market, and start to proactively make decisions on pay in that context, so that we have the ability as we go further down the line to talk about things like pay ranges, to talk about things like how you compare to a midpoint of a pay range.
Okay, so you changed your job architecture and the number of levels that you have. Is there something in particular that prompted this change, or are there a number of things like you mentioned around pay equity?
I think that stating our pay philosophy, absolutely, and was a big driver. So that's something that we've only recently considered and sought to introduce, and so that was a big driver. I think the other big driver is just the general frustrations that we were starting to experience in the business, whereby we found people were really pushing for a role to be graded at what we would call our management level 5, because there was just this ether of everything else. And rather than acknowledge that you could have, very meaty, meaningful managerial roles in the roles below our level 5, we were undermining that by just having a general population. So a team leader of a very large shared service team, for example, there would be no means of differentiating that from the administrator that would sit in their team. And that's what we were finding was driving a lot of frustration in the business. So it was off the basis of two things, really. Yes, wanting to have and stand by a meaningful kind of pay philosophy, and kind of tackle some of the frustrations that we were seeing manifest as a result of not having that differentiation.
Okay, and with introducing the changes to your job architecture, is this something you also had to discuss with the unions and as part of the collective agreement, or does it sit outside of those agreements?
It sits outside because this was about our non-collectively bargained population, and defining a structure and a means of managing pay. Because in our collective bargaining world, we have quite a rigid means of managing pay, quite a structured way of managing pay. We didn't have that same structure in the non-collectively bargained space.
Okay. The job architecture piece is really interesting because, for many things, I think job architecture just sets the foundation to enable you to look at so many other areas. Then what do you see as the biggest opportunity for you in implementing this structure? What do you think is going to really enable you to do?
Absolutely. And we always talked when we first introduced it about it being the laying the foundations of and all of the things that can then come off of that. So the reward and pay approach is absolutely driven off that reward job architecture. But so it are a lot of real basics when it comes to our systems infrastructure as well. And we were really noticing an absence of a decent job architecture in the way that our system operated, our main people system operated. We were losing a lot of opportunity for automation because we didn't have that structure in place. But then it's so much more than that. And I think, again, kind of describing that maturity journey, you start with the foundation, you build the infrastructure and the basics around how your system operates, you get the structure from a reward perspective, but then the doors open in terms of career development, in terms of skills profiles, in terms of all of those things around career conversations, development conversations. You open the door to all of that with that job architecture as well.
That's great. I mean, the job architecture, like you said, it links very much to pay and reward. And when you talked earlier about fair, equitable, transparent approach to pay, I think it's very difficult to do that without having a good job architecture in place. It's just the foundation for it. I know that something else that a lot of HR professionals are currently thinking about, because it's the time of year when they're setting budgets for next year of pay review, for example, and they're wondering whether, if you have a budget of 3%, should that budget be applied the same to everyone, or should there be differentiation? And I know that you had a slightly different approach, and could you tell us how you approached your pay budgets and applied it to different populations?
No, absolutely. And for me, this is that kind of driving differentiator between equal approach and equitable approach. So language very much borrowed from kind of D&I initiatives. But to take an equal approach, you might apply that percentage to everybody and think, great, job done, we're being equal. But actually that doesn't recognise that there are different starting points. And for somebody that's on 70k and for somebody that's on 30k, over time, applying a flat same percentage for those populations is only going to drive the differentiation in their pay. And so we want to take an equitable approach, recognise that there was a percentage that we would treat as a budget, but that we would take a tiered approach to pay. So those that were lower earners received a higher percentage pay increase than those that were higher earners who received a lower percentage. Now, everybody benefited from a pay review, everybody benefited from a review of their salary against market and against internal relativity, but that helped us drive an equitable approach. It helped our managers making kind of pay decisions, whereas previously we had worked with a percentage that tended to get applied to everybody, and managers would make some discretion outside of that where they saw fit. This approach really changed the dial for us, really shifted the dial for us in terms of taking an equitable approach to pay. So really proud of the analysis that we did and getting the manager buy-in to take that approach.
Yeah, I mean, it's such a great point around the equal versus the equitable approach. Because I think sometimes actually when we speak to unions, you can get the sense of, well, everyone should be treated the same with an equal approach. but like you explained, it is not necessarily fair. And actually, we sometimes do even see that at a role level. So, you could have two people doing the same job. One person is on 50K, the other person's on 60K. And even in that scenario, within the same job, we could think of applying different increases because for whatever reason, these two people were recruited on different salaries. But what we should do is try and bridge the gap over time. I guess that applies probably more to your non-collectively bargained population, but is that an approach that you've also considered or you think about when you're looking at equity?
Yes, so absolutely right. I think you absolutely described the issue of, yes, there might be different factors that drive why somebody might be on different pay to start with. But if we're not really considered and all things remain equal in terms of what they deliver and their performance in the role, that gap is only going to perpetuate if we don't take, a targeted approach of resolving that. So absolutely. And for our non-collectively bargained populations, as you describe, we have got more licensed to be in control of addressing those, those equity issues, those fairness issues. When it comes to the collectively bargained, it is really difficult. The unions are absolutely up for the conversations, and I have found them to be, engaged in the conversation and the dialogue. But what we find, and we still find, and I'm sure it will be, a much longer journey, that when it comes to the rubber hitting the road, when it comes to those pay talks, it is very much about what can I do and achieve best for my, my unit that I'm responsible for, my collective bargaining unit that I'm responsible for. So for me, it just comes with the constant reiteration of the strategy, the approach, the constant reminder of the business position and the stance and why we want to take the stance that we do, and equipping, like I said, our operators who go into those consultations with as much data and insights as they can to really hit that point home.
Okay. If having been on this journey of updating your job architecture and having all of these conversations with unions, if any of our listeners are thinking, well, we have to deal with a lot of unions or we struggle with these conversations, what is the one tip that you would give or advice that you would give to say, this is something that has helped you in building a good relationship with the unions, whether it's to do with pay negotiations or any other conversations? What would that one tip be?
Oh, goodness. If I had a magic wand, I imagine the listeners would really appreciate just the difficulty in that union dynamic. I do think it does bring a lot of value. I think organisations who recognise the importance and value of the union relationship are the ones that get it right. But it can be an antagonistic relationship that is rooted in the history and the legacy of unions. So, gosh, I wouldn't profess to say I had the answer of what the one biggest thing is. But I think just going back to the strategy we've tried to take, which is if you have an environment like ours where there is a lot of decentralisation, where there is a lot of different bargaining units, I think it's having that recognised group of internal business leaders that are responsible for pay negotiations, absolutely being on the same page, absolutely understanding what that company standpoint is, and being able to really articulate the narrative around reasons and wherefores of where we want to move on pay, and having an environment where they share their experiences their challenges, what worked, what didn't work. So I think a really unified kind of business proposition, a network, because our unions are absolutely doing that as a counter. They are really connected in that sense. So that's what I would say.
Okay, thanks, Rebecca. I think that I would just, I guess, add one point around that, which is, when we are sometimes speaking to unions or having these conversations, obviously, their objective is to make sure that the best outcome is achieved for the employees, and we just try and, the language that you used earlier around fair and equitable approach to pay and transparency, I think that's the language that they very much like, and I'm not surprised that you have a good relationship with your unions. So thanks a lot for your tips, and I'm sure a lot of our listeners will try and use some of your tips when having these conversations. Before you go, I'm going to have to ask you the question I ask all my guests, which is, what is your favourite film and why?
Yes, so you did prep me on this question, Rameez, and this is the one thing that I've been agonising over in terms of what would my response be. So I had to hark back and go really old school and go to what was a firm favourite as a kid, and it's got to be Drop Dead Fred. I don't know if it's going to be a very well-known movie, but it's Rick Mayall. It's about a young woman who gets her imaginary friend back from childhood and just wreaks havoc in her life for a little bit, but it's the ultimate betterment of things. So yes, that's my answer. Drop Dead Fred. Brilliant. If no one's seen it, it's definitely worth a watch.
Okay. Great. Thanks, Rebecca. Thanks, everyone, for listening. I hope you found it helpful, and we'll speak to you on the next episode of A Case of the Mondays.
Enjoy this episode? Join the Academy for free and have access to CPD certified reward training, quarterly reward community sessions, first access to salary insights reports, reward and benefits market data, and hundreds of free practical tools and templates.